So hello and welcome back to the fifth and final part of this Qt Design Studio tutorial series. Now last time we introduced our mock data JavaScript simulation and connected it up to our UI. And as I mentioned at the end, I've gone ahead and fixed some things off screen. So why don't we take a look at that before we get going again. And then the last thing to do after that is create our boot up animation. So let's start by taking a look at our ISO icon panel. We can see here in the values.qml file, I've introduced two Boolean values, one for the engine temperature and one for the fuel level. And they're also in the JavaScript file. And inside the JavaScript here, you can see there's just a simple if statement that if our engine temperature for the RPM is above a certain value, then the engine bool is true, and otherwise it's set to false. And we do something very similar here for the fuel gauge, where if it's underneath a certain value, our low fuel value, then the fuel level bool is set to true as well, and otherwise it's false. So if we look at our ISO component, we can see here that the engine icon for the tachometer property has this binding with the engine temp variable. And the fuel icon has a very similar binding with this fuel level variable. And what this does is it simply replaces the checkboxes that we have here to trigger the icons on and off. Now, obviously I've also renamed these files, and I'll quickly show you how I did that. First, I want to reset all these property aliases here, and the reason I do that is to make sure there's no code entries here. So if we just scroll down, we can see here we have the two code entries that we need for the bindings, and all the rest are reset. Now, if there were code entries in there, when I change the name of these properties, we'd get an error message in our main file. So now, let's just look for the aircon, find out what it's called, find it in the properties, click on the property and rename that to aircon active. Now when we go back up to our main view and select the component, we can see that our property has a new name. Okay, let's just reset all of these to false. To show you what I mean about the code, let's have a look now, and you can see there's actually an entry inside the code for each of these values. And then the last thing I did was I created this gear indicator panel. Now this uses a different state for each gear, and with all the gear artwork we created in Photoshop. So let's go into the component and have a look at how we've done this. So inside our base state we have all of our gears. And we have a text item for the number for our gear. And in each state we simply set the opacity for the image we want to 1, and we set all the other ones down to 0, so that only one gear indicator icon is visible in each state. Here it's 2, and all the rest are 0. Here it's 3, 4, and finally 5. Now we see all of our states for our gear icon. Okay, so we have these when conditions, and you can see here that it's gearbox current gear equals 1. And to control this, we've created a property here in the root item of the component, which is an integer, has the name current gear. By default, it's set to 1. And this is what this when condition uses to evaluate here. So this one says when the current gear equals 2, and when the current gear equals 3, and so on, 4 and 5. Okay, let's save that, go back up to our main file. If we highlight that component, we can see this current gear property here. And this has a binding to our backend data values current gear. So let's take a quick look at that. And we see here we have an integer called current gear. It's set to a default value of 1. In the JavaScript, right down at the bottom, we just have a simple function that counts up and down the gears depending on the position of the speedometer. And that will update our gear variable in our QML file. So let's take a quick look at that running. And here we see our gear changes. And again. And here we see the ISO icon being triggered when we go over that value that we set in our JavaScript file. And we can just speed up this one and take a look at the fuel gauge. And there we see that our fuel gauge icon turns on. Okay, great. So that's mostly it for the backend part. Let's move on and make a boot up animation. Now we're also going to use our QML file and a timeline to move from this boot animation to the running state of our UI. But the first thing we need to do is set up some states. So let's take a look at that. Here in the state panel we have the base state. Here we're going to bring in all of our effects. Everything added to the base state exists in that position in all other states. And changes you make to these items in a state only affects the local properties for that state. So this means all of the effects we add here will be added to our running state and our boot state. So let's create a new state for our boot animation by clicking on the plus button, and we will rename this boot state. Here we're going to add a timeline for our animations and all the effects that we want. And then we're going to make another state called running state. And as I said before, any effects we add to our base state will also get added here. So we may need to go in here and disable or set certain parameters for our effects so that they're not visible during the running state of our UI. But essentially this one's going to stay exactly the same as it is right now. So let's take a look at the logic that controls this. We have here in our QML file we have a bool for for the booting, and that's set to true by default. So each time it loads, it will automatically first go into the boot state. And we have this read-only property, which is the duration, the boot duration. We also have a timer here. This is the timer for our boot up animation. And it's set to running true and repeat false, so it only runs once. And at the end, it will reset this booting bool to false. And the length of this timer is set to our boot duration. So also we just need to uncomment this little bit of logic from our other timers, and essentially what this says is that the running state of all of our other timers is true when the booting variable is false. So that means that the timers won't start running while the boot animation is on, but will only actually start as soon as the boot animation is finished, which is exactly how we want it. So let's save that, and go back into our main file. And we want to create a timeline for our boot animation, so let's do that by clicking on the Add Timeline. We'll give it a name, and we'll set the duration to the same length as we had in our code, so 5000. Let's create the animation. We want it to be running. We're going to set the end and the duration to the same values as we have above. And for this settings, we don't want it to be continuous, and we only want one loop. So the rest of these settings are fine. Let's close that. And now we have our timeline ready for our boot up animation. So the next thing we need to do is set up some when conditions, so we know when to start the boot state and when to start the running state. And this is just a question of putting data.values booting, which is our bool that we introduced. And so when that's true, we'll be in the boot state. And for the running state, we use exactly the same binding, data.values booting. But this time we put an exclamation point at the beginning, and that just means that when that value is false, we're in the running state. So now with all the logic in place, we can test that it's working by bringing up our live preview. And as you see, nothing happens here at the beginning, which is what we want because we haven't added any animations yet. As soon as the time has elapsed that we set, our running state kicks in. So now we know that our states are working and all of our logic's in place, we can actually start animating the effects that we want. Okay, so with that set up, let's start our animation. We're going to start with the speedometer, and we're going to use a studio component called flippable. So let's bring in the studio components, and this object here allows us to create a two-sided object that's a bit like a coin with our dial on one face and another image on the other. And then we can animate that, so as the image rotates around the y-axis, and when it gets past that perpendicular point, the image flips and becomes our dial. So let's drag this flippable item into our navigator underneath our speed dial. We want to center this on our component where the rotational axis will be. And then we want to drag it out and position it so it's large enough to contain all of our artwork. So let's just drag it out a bit bigger than our speedometer component. And when that's ready, we're just going to make the speed dial a child of the flippable item. And then we need to import our second image that we want to be on the other side. So let's click on this Add New Resources button. Select our image and bring that into our project. And position it where we want it, and then make that a child of our flippable item. Okay, so if we go into our boot animation state, we can animate this flippable item. We'll start by inserting a keyframe at the beginning. We want to set this flip angle. We can refresh the view to make sure that it's correct. So we just have the image at the beginning. We'll go in a certain length and we'll insert another keyframe of the same value. And then we'll move a bit forward on in the timeline. And we'll set this flip angle once more, so it's rotated around and we see our gauge. Okay, if we can see that in the live preview. So it waits and then it flips around. So this is a good time to introduce another feature of Design Studio, and that's our custom easing curve picker. If you highlight the keyframe and click on this icon, it brings up a library of custom easing curves. And we can easily just choose one from our library here, apply it to our keyframe. In this case, it will start slowly and speed up as it goes forward. And you can see that the keyframe icon's changed. And now if we look at that in live preview, we see that it starts slowly, and then the spin speeds up as we come to the end. Okay, we can always just adjust the timing by fiddling with our keyframes. Okay, so why don't we animate the opacity of this so it fades on. To do that, we're going to insert a keyframe at the beginning with a value of 0. And we just need to make sure that this really is on the 0 frame, so we can zoom in and check. And if it's not, just drag it back, make sure it is on the 0 keyframe. And we need to also make sure that it has a value of 0. So if for some reason it didn't work, you can always go in here, edit the value directly for that keyframe, and there we see it's disappeared. Let's drag out a certain amount onto the timeline. That will do. And we're going to insert another keyframe with a value of 1. So insert a keyframe, a value of 1. Just check that there. Okay. We can also select an easing curve for this keyframe. So this, it will start fast and slow down as it reaches the keyframe. So we'll save it and take a look, and there we see our very subtle fade in, and then our rotation. And then it goes into the running state. Okay, so with that one done, why don't we just go back to the beginning frame, and we're just going to turn off our gear indicator for now. We don't want that in the boot animation, so we're going to set the opacity to 0 at the beginning, and we go all the way through And we can set another 0 value if we like. We don't have to, but we may as well. Now the gear frame is not going to be visible in our boot up animation. So why don't we start by animating another dial? So let's just choose the tachometer. Let's bring in the studio effects. What we're going to use for this one is a directional blur. So we drag that onto our scene. Here. And we're going to line that up so it's bigger than our component, so it fits our component completely inside it with a bit of space for the effect. Like so. And one thing we actually need to take care of here is if we see our tachometer component, we can see that some of the numbers are actually outside the bounding box for the component. Now that didn't matter so far because we could still see the numbers in our running state, but when we apply this into an effect, we need to make sure that all the content is inside our component, otherwise it will be clipped out of the effect. So these here, they would be clipped out. Now, in order to fix this, I'm going to use another item for convenience, bring that into my scene, and then I'm just going to carefully drop all of my artwork into the item to make everything a child of this item. And the reason I do this is then I can reposition this single item and it will move all of my artwork for me, and I don't have to manually reposition everything again. So I'm just making sure that everything I want to move is inside the item. We can make that item bigger. It doesn't really matter. It's only there for organizational purposes, and it's only there to keep all of our artwork nicely together so we don't accidentally move one piece without the others. Okay, so now let's make the component a bit bigger so that we can fit all of our artwork in. We select the item that we just created, and now we can reposition everything inside this component so it will work properly with our effect. So let's go back into our boot animation timeline. We see there that everything's contained within it. We'll make the RPM dial a child of the directional blur. Refresh so we can see the effect. There we go. And now we just want to animate this. We'll turn that off. So let's start by animating the opacity. We'll make it fade on. So we'll set a 0 keyframe. We'll set this keyframe to 0 where we want the fade to start. And then we'll add in another keyframe with the opacity set to 1, where we want it to be fully visible on our screen. Okay, so there we have our fading animation. Let's do the same for scaling. So we'll insert a keyframe at the beginning, where the scale is set to 0. We'll come back up to here. Insert another keyframe with a value of 0, where we want the scaling to start. And then here finally we'll set the scale to 1. So now we just do the same for our directional blur. So let's give it a large value at the beginning. We want it to be very blurred. We'll insert a keyframe with the same value here, where the animations start. And then here we'll turn the blur down to 0, where we want the effect to finish. Okay, and we can always just drag out, select all of these keyframes together, apply an easing curve for everything, and then we can test and see how that looks. Okay, we don't really see the blur effect yet because it happens too fast. So let's adjust that in our timeline. Close the live preview, come down, and actually we just want to select this keyframe, and we'll drag it out a bit further so that we can see our blur effect better in our animation. And now we see that the blur effect is more visible in the boot up animation. We'll turn the record keyframe button off, and then we'll drag another directional blur effect in underneath our fuel gauge. We want to scale and position that over our fuel gauge so that it contains all of our artwork with space for the effect. And we're going to go back into this component like we did for the other one, and just make sure that all of our artwork is contained inside the bounding box for the component. So here, where these numbers are outside of our bounding box, they would be clipped. So let's bring in an item. Drag that up to the top. And then we'll make all of our artwork a child of this item. And again, we're just doing this for convenience so that we can move one item and it will move all of the rest of our artwork around. And then we don't accidentally drag something out of position or mess up all the work that we've already done here. So let's increase the size of our root component so it contains all of the artwork, so there's enough space for everything. And then we'll select this item and reposition all of our artwork so it's nicely inside the bounding box for our component. Okay, that's good. Now we can go back up to our main file. And we're going to make our component a child of the effect. We'll reload it so that we can see it in the form viewer. All right, so now we see our effect. And let's just reposition it, line it up with our other dial. I think that looks okay. What we're going to do for this one is actually just select our previous one, copy all the keyframes from this item, highlight our new directional blur, go to timeline, paste all keyframes to item, and now we've just duplicated the animation entirely. So we have two animations are exactly the same for these two gauges, and we can see there. Let's bring up the live preview, save everything. Now we see both of our gauges animate on exactly the same. Okay, so for our ISO animation, we're going to use another directional blur just to keep things consistent. So we'll go across to our effects. We'll drag another one in underneath our ISO panel. We'll scale it out and position it over the top of our ISO panel. Make the ISO panel a child of the blur. Reload our page so that we can see the effect. Turn on our keyframe recorder And we'll scale, so we'll start at 0 at the beginning. And come up to the timeline, a bit further even. Insert another keyframe, and then drag out a bit more. Set the scale up to 1. Repeat the process for the opacity. I'll set the opacity to 1 here. That scales up. And of course, when you're animating, you just want to play around with these values and testing it each time until you really have it how you want. But for now, we're not going to worry too much about everything being perfect because we want to be able to finish this video. Let's set another keyframe right at the beginning with a value of 0 so that we know that it's going to be not visible and really until we want it. Okay, and then we can animate this directional blur. So we'll introduce a keyframe here where the blur is high. And another one where we want the effect to start fading out. And then we'll drag out to here and set that to 0. We can select all of these, give them an easing curve. We'll preview our animation. Okay, so there we see our animation. And of course we can just fiddle with these, drag them around on the timeline. Drag these ones, drag this one out and make it a bit longer. Select all of these, drag them all out to make them a bit longer. Give them a different easing curve. And the same here. Apply a different easing curve to these. Turn off our recorder and run the live preview to see our animation. Okay, so I think that looks nice for now. You can always carry on and fiddle with these, try different effects. You can really fine-tune these animations until you have it exactly how you want it. Okay, the one thing that we do notice is that our gear indicator icon is missing from the running state. Now this is because we set the opacity to 0 while we were doing the animation, and we haven't actually set that back to 1 in our running state, which we need to do in order that we see it when it switches into that second state. So let's come back in here. We'll go into our running state. We select our gearbox component here. We see the opacity 0, so let's just set the opacity to 1 in the running state. Save it. You see there the difference between the boot animation state and the running state. Let's take a look at this now. Okay, and now we see we have our gear indicator component back in our running state. So there we have it, our finished UI, designed in Photoshop and exported across into Qt Design Studio, where we've created all of the animations and our mock data backend. And I hope you found this tutorial series useful as an introduction into Qt Design Studio, and also that it might have inspired some of you designers out there with ideas about how you can bring your concepts to life. So thank you very much for watching, and I'm sure I'll see you again in a future tutorial series.